A black doctor is accused of assault when he tries to save a white man. The police won't listen to his explanation, and viewers learn how one biased decision will change the life of an innocent man. Can justice be served? Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Write in the comments where you watch this video, and do you think it could have ended differently? The quiet hum of the hospital's corridors had been a constant companion for Dr. Michael Wright throughout his long shift. For the past 15 hours, he had been treating patients with various ailments, from broken bones to life-threatening illnesses. His expertise as a seasoned physician had been put to the test multiple times that day, yet he had handled each case with precision and care. Now, as the day was drawing to a close, he was ready to return home. His family had sent him texts throughout the day, and the thought of finally seeing his wife and children after a long, taxing day lifted his spirits. Michael had always been committed to his work. Ever since he graduated from medical school, he had taken pride in the trust people placed in him to save lives. He was a man of integrity, deeply compassionate, and known for his calm demeanor in high-pressure situations. But tonight, as he finally left the hospital and stepped into the cool night air, all he wanted was peace and quiet, a simple evening with his loved ones. He started his car and pulled out of the parking lot, mentally listing the things he had to do the next day. Another long shift awaited him, but tonight he would rest. The streets were nearly deserted at this late hour, and the familiar sound of his car engine created a sense of calm as he drove down the quiet, winding road that would take him home. The road was lined with tall trees, their branches casting long shadows in the moonlight. Street lights flickered sporadically, illuminating patches of the asphalt while leaving the rest in darkness. It was a route Michael knew well, one he had driven countless times before, but tonight something felt different. The usual stillness in the air felt heavier, almost foreboding. As he rounded a curve, something caught his eye on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just a discarded piece of trash, but as his headlights swept over the figure, he realized it was a person, a man, lying motionless on the ground near the edge of the road. Michael's instinct as a doctor kicked in immediately. His fatigue vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Without a second thought, he pulled his car to a stop on the shoulder, grabbed his medical bag from the back seat, and hurried toward the man. The stillness of the scene was eerie. There were no other cars around. No signs of life apart from the unconscious figure in front of him. Kneeling beside the man, Michael quickly assessed the situation. The man, middle-aged and white, wasn't responding. His breathing was shallow and his pulse weak but present. Michael's hands moved deftly, performing basic checks, his mind racing through possibilities. Was it a heart attack? A stroke? Had he been injured? The man was dressed in casual clothes, jeans and a jacket, and there were no obvious signs of trauma, no blood or wounds that would suggest he had been attacked or involved in an accident. Still, something was very wrong. Time was critical, and Michael knew that whatever had caused the man to collapse could escalate quickly if he didn't receive medical attention soon. Michael checked his watch. He needed to call for an ambulance, but in the meantime, he would do what he could to stabilize the man. He opened his medical bag, pulling out the necessary tools, and began working methodically, focusing solely on his patient. His training had taught him to compartmentalize, to shut out distractions in moments like these, and now he was fully in doctor mode. The cool night air brushed against his skin as he worked, heightening his senses. His focus was so intense that he didn't notice the faint sound of an approaching car until it was already near. Headlights flooded the scene, casting long shadows across the road. Michael didn't look up at first, assuming it was just a passerby, someone who would keep driving, but the car slowed as it neared, eventually pulling over to the side of the road just behind Michael's vehicle. For a brief moment, Michael's mind flickered with concern. It was late, and the road was isolated. He didn't want to be disturbed while helping the man, but perhaps the driver was just curious. A middle-aged man stepped out of the car, his face partially hidden in the shadow. Michael sensed the person's hesitation as they approached. "Hey, everything all right here?" the man called out, his voice filled with uncertainty. Michael glanced up, nodding briefly. "I'm a doctor. This man's unconscious. I'm stabilizing him until I can call for help." The man's expression shifted. It was subtle, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Michael had seen before, though he couldn't immediately place it. Fear? Distrust? Perhaps even suspicion. "I see," the man replied, his voice now more guarded. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the scene as if trying to piece together something that didn't fit in his mind. Michael didn't have time to dwell on it. He continued his work, checking the unconscious man's pulse again, but something about the other man's presence unsettled him. The way the man hovered nearby, watching, felt invasive, almost accusatory. Michael had no reason to feel guilty. He was helping someone in need, but he couldn't shake the discomfort creeping up his spine. After a moment, the man behind him pulled out his phone. Michael didn't notice at first, focused as he was on his patient, but the distant sound of the man's voice brought him back to the present. "Yeah, I'm on West Road near the bend. There's a guy, black guy, kneeling next to some white dude, looks unconscious. Something's not right here. You might want to send someone." The words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. He froze for a moment, disbelief washing over him. Did this man just... He couldn't have misunderstood, but the emphasis on black guy and white dude made it clear. This stranger wasn't seeing a doctor trying to save a life. He saw a threat, an intruder, someone who didn't belong. Michael swallowed hard, trying to focus. He had to ignore it. The man on the ground was his priority, but now every movement felt heavier, every glance from the stranger more intense. What had been a life-saving mission now felt like something darker, more dangerous. He wasn't just battling time to save this man's life. He was battling assumptions and prejudices, too. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Michael continued his work, barely able to push aside the tension building inside him. He had called for an ambulance, but the other man had called the police, and that changed everything. The road remained empty except for their two cars, the unconscious man and the looming presence of the stranger, who now stood farther back, watching with a mixture of suspicion and unease. Michael's heart raced, but not from the medical emergency in front of him. It was the growing certainty that he was being judged, not for his actions, but for who he was. The sound of sirens cut through the stillness, growing louder by the second. The flashing lights appeared in the distance, and Michael let out a silent breath of relief. Help was on the way. Medical help. But then, behind the ambulance, he saw the flashing lights of a police car, and with it, everything was about to get much, much worse. The sirens pierced the stillness of the night, growing louder with each second. Michael's pulse quickened as the ambulance came into view, its flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark road in a chaotic swirl. But behind it, the unmistakable glare of a police cruiser's lights appeared, casting an ominous shadow over what should have been a moment of relief. Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His hands were still on the unconscious man, carefully monitoring his pulse and breathing. He told himself to focus, to stay in control, but the sight of the approaching police cruiser filled him with a growing sense of dread. He had always been careful to stay calm under pressure, a skill he'd honed over years of medical practice. But this felt different. The situation had taken on a life of its own, and now it wasn't just about saving a life, it was about defending his own actions, his own character. The ambulance pulled up first, and the paramedics quickly jumped out, hurrying toward him. Michael stood up slowly, stepping aside to allow them access to the unconscious man. He explained the situation briefly, his voice steady but tense. "I found him on the side of the road, unconscious. He's breathing but unresponsive. I think it could be a heart attack or stroke. I started administering first aid while waiting for help." The paramedics nodded, quickly assessing the man as they prepared to move him onto a stretcher. They were professional, efficient, and focused on their task. But before Michael could take a breath of relief, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming shut behind him. He turned to see the two officers from the police cruiser approaching. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hard, unreadable expression, immediately caught Michael's attention. His name tag read Officer Jackson, and even from a distance, his body language radiated hostility. The other officer, a woman named Officer Emily Turner, followed closely behind, her face more neutral but wary. Jackson's hand hovered near his belt, close to the holster, as if ready to draw his weapon at any moment. "Step away from the man," Jackson barked, his voice sharp and commanding. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't approach with curiosity or concern. He approached with authority, with judgment already written across his face. Michael froze for a moment, instinctively raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. The tension in the air was palpable. The paramedics continued working on the man, but Michael could feel the shift in the dynamic. He was no longer just a doctor helping a patient. He was now being seen as something else entirely. "I'm a doctor," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I found this man unconscious and was administering first aid. The paramedics are handling it now." Jackson's eyes narrowed, his hand still hovering near his belt. He didn't seem to care about Michael's explanation. His gaze flicked to the paramedics, then back to Michael, as if trying to piece together a story that aligned with his own assumptions. "I need you to step back," Jackson ordered, taking a step closer, away from the scene. Michael hesitated for a moment, unsure if stepping back would make things worse. The paramedics had taken control of the situation, and he knew his job was done medically. But the way Jackson stared at him, as if he were a criminal rather than a doctor, sent a chill down his spine. Officer Turner, standing behind Jackson, glanced at the paramedics, her brow furrowed. She seemed to be weighing the situation, but it was clear that Jackson was in charge. She didn't intervene, didn't stop his aggressive approach. "I've done everything I could," Michael said carefully, stepping back as requested. "The paramedics are taking over." Jackson didn't move, his eyes still locked on Michael as though he were waiting for him to slip up. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. This was no routine stop for him. This was a confrontation, one he was ready to escalate if necessary. The paramedics worked swiftly, moving the unconscious man onto the stretcher and preparing to load him into the ambulance. The entire scene felt surreal to Michael, who was used to working alongside paramedics in emergency situations. But now, He was the one being scrutinized, the one under suspicion. Just as the paramedics were about to lift the stretcher, the unconscious man stirred. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, and his gaze landed on Michael, who stood a few feet away. Confusion crossed the man's face, then something darker. Recognition, perhaps, but not the kind that would bring clarity. Instead, the man's expression twisted into fear. "Get him away from me," the man croaked, his voice weak but filled with panic. "He attacked me." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. The paramedics paused, momentarily unsure of what to do. Officer Jackson's face lit up with a kind of satisfaction, as if the man's accusation had confirmed everything he already believed. "I didn't attack him," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "I was helping him. I'm a doctor." But it didn't matter. Jackson was already moving closer, his hand now firmly gripping his gun. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of power and prejudice, and Michael knew that nothing he said would change the narrative Jackson had constructed in his mind. "Turn around and put your hands on your head," Jackson growled, pulling his gun from its holster and aiming it at Michael. "Now." Michael's heart raced, and for a brief second he considered running, but he knew that would only make things worse. He raised his hands slowly, every movement careful, deliberate. He was a man who had saved countless lives, who had dedicated himself to healing. And now, in the span of a few minutes, he had become a suspect, a threat, in the eyes of a man who couldn't see past the color of his skin. Officer Turner took a hesitant step forward, her expression conflicted. She seemed to sense that something was wrong, that Jackson was overreacting. But she didn't stop him. Whether out of fear or deference, she remained silent as Jackson moved to restrain Michael. Michael felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around his wrists, the weight of them pulling him down, not just physically, but emotionally. The injustice of it all washed over him in a wave. He had done everything right. He had followed his training, acted with compassion and professionalism, and yet, here he was, being treated like a criminal. The paramedics exchanged uneasy glances as they continued loading the unconscious man into the ambulance. They had seen enough to know something wasn't right, but they were not in a position to intervene. As Jackson roughly guided Michael toward the police car, Michael caught a glimpse of the paramedics shaking their heads slightly, their eyes filled with sympathy and confusion. They knew he wasn't guilty of any crime. They knew he had been trying to help, but in this moment their knowledge meant nothing. The other man, the one Michael had tried to save, was now stable, but he continued to mutter accusations, his voice weak but insistent. Whether it was the fog of confusion, fear, or something deeper rooted in prejudice, Michael couldn't know, but his words were enough to fuel Jackson's determination. "Looks like you thought you could get away with it, huh?" Jackson sneered as he pushed Michael into the back of the police car. "We're not stupid. I've seen your kind before. You're all the same." Michael stared straight ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout the truth, but he knew it wouldn't matter. In that moment, he was nothing more than a suspect in Jackson's eyes, not a doctor, not a man who had devoted his life to saving others. Just a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate, at least for the moment. The flashing lights outside the car cast eerie shadows across the interior, and for the first time in his life, Michael felt truly powerless. In the distance, the ambulance drove away, carrying the man he had tried to save, and Michael was left alone in the back of the police car, with Jackson's words echoing in his ears. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Michael's wrists as he sat in the back of the police car, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The rhythmic flashing of the blue and red lights outside painted the inside of the cruiser in unsettling streaks of color, as though the world itself had been thrown off balance. The injustice of what was happening weighed heavily on him, but in that moment, he had no time to process it. All he could do was focus on breathing, trying to remain calm as the situation spiraled further out of control. Outside, Officer Jackson was speaking into his radio, his voice authoritative and clipped. He hadn't given Michael a second look since throwing him into the back of the car, as though his job was done, and his assumptions had been confirmed. In Jackson's mind, Michael was already guilty. The details didn't matter. Michael's throat felt tight as he watched through the window. The paramedics were still there, securing the unconscious man into the back of the ambulance. One of them, a younger man, looked back toward the police cruiser with a concerned expression, his brow furrowed as if he wanted to say something but knew better than to interfere. Michael's thoughts raced as the weight of the handcuffs dug deeper into his skin. He had been trained to keep his composure in the most stressful situations: emergency surgeries, critical trauma cases, moments where life and death hung in the balance. But this was different. This wasn't something his medical training had prepared him for. This was a situation where no amount of expertise or professionalism could save him. The back door of the police cruiser opened, and Jackson climbed in, his face a mask of authority and disdain. He didn't look at Michael as he sat down in the driver's seat, adjusting the radio on his chest. "Dispatch, I've got a black male in custody," Jackson said into his radio. His voice carried the same certainty as if he were reporting a routine traffic violation. "Suspect was found at the scene of an assault. Victim is being transported to the hospital. We'll bring the suspect in for questioning." The words felt like a punch to Michael's gut. Suspect. That was who he was now. Not a doctor, not a man who had stopped to help, but a suspect in some imagined crime. The absurdity of it all made his stomach churn, but there was no use protesting now. He had seen it too many times, the assumption of guilt based solely on the color of his skin. Officer Turner, who had remained quiet until now, walked over to the passenger side of the car. She paused, glancing briefly at Michael through the window. For a moment, her eyes softened, and Michael thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her expression. But she quickly masked it, opening the door and sliding into the passenger seat beside Jackson. "We need to get him back to the station," Jackson said as he revved the engine, pulling the car away from the scene. "Let's see what kind of story he tries to spin once we get him in the interrogation room." Turner didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flicked back to Michael in the rearview mirror, and for a second, their gazes locked. Michael saw something in her face, a hesitation, a question she wasn't asking. He could sense that she wasn't entirely comfortable with how Jackson was handling the situation, but she wasn't challenging him either. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Officer Turner," he began, addressing her directly, trying to reach the part of her that still seemed open to reason. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm a doctor. I was helping that man when he collapsed. I didn't hurt him. You have to understand that." Turner glanced at Jackson, who stiffened at the sound of Michael's voice. "You'll have a chance to tell your side of the story at the station," Jackson snapped, his tone sharp. "For now, you keep quiet." Michael sat back, biting his tongue. Arguing wouldn't get him anywhere right now, not with Jackson, but Turner. There was something in her hesitation that made him think she might listen, that she might be willing to look past the surface and see the truth. The car sped down the empty road, the night stretching out endlessly before them. Michael's thoughts were consumed with the events of the last hour. How had everything gone so wrong, so quickly? One moment he had been a doctor saving a life, and the next he was sitting in the back of a police car branded as a criminal. His mind flashed back to the man on the ground, his pale face twisted in confusion and fear as he accused Michael of attacking him. It didn't make sense. Michael had done nothing but try to help. But the man's fear had spoken louder than reason, louder than logic. And Jackson had been all too willing to accept the false narrative, to see what he wanted to see. As they approached the station, Michael's heart pounded harder. He knew what was coming. Hours of questioning, of being treated like a suspect, of having to defend himself against baseless accusations. And, in the meantime, his family would be waiting for him at home, wondering why he hadn't come back, why his calls had gone unanswered. His children would ask where their father was, and his wife would worry, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The car came to a stop in front of the police station, the stark building looming ahead like a fortress. Jackson got out first, roughly yanking the door open and pulling Michael out of the back seat. The handcuffs bit into his wrists again as Jackson shoved him toward the entrance. Turner followed behind, her expression unreadable, though Michael still sensed her unease. She wasn't like Jackson, not as overtly hostile, not as consumed by her own prejudices. But she wasn't stopping him either, and in this moment, her silence was as damning as Jackson's actions. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the dull, gray walls. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional murmur of officers talking in low tones. Jackson marched Michael through the hallway, past rows of desks and filing cabinets, straight toward the holding area. "Let's get you booked," Jackson said, his voice laced with satisfaction. "Then we'll see what kind of story you've got." Michael clenched his jaw, saying nothing. There was no use arguing now. He would have to wait, bide his time, and hope that someone, anyone, would take the time to listen to him, to hear the truth. As Jackson led him into the holding area, Turner hesitated by the entrance. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider speaking up, but then she caught Jackson's eye, and whatever thought had crossed her mind vanished. She nodded stiffly, turning away as Jackson pushed Michael into the small, cold cell. The clang of the cell door closing behind him echoed in the empty room. Michael stood there for a moment, his hands still cuffed, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with each passing second. He was a doctor, a man who had spent his entire career saving lives. And now he was behind bars, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Jackson smirked from the other side of the bars, the satisfaction of power clear on his face. "Enjoy your stay," he said, before turning and walking away, leaving Michael alone in the dimly lit cell. Michael sat down on the cold metal bench, his mind reeling. He had seen stories like this play out before, heard about the injustice faced by so many others who looked like him, but now it was happening to him. He was living it. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He had to stay focused. He had to find a way out of this. There had to be someone who would listen, someone who would believe him. Minutes passed, then hours. Michael didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the walls of his cell, replaying the events in his mind. He knew that his colleagues at the hospital would eventually wonder why he hadn't come home, but he also knew that the system wasn't always quick to correct its mistakes. He could be stuck here for hours, even days, before anyone believed he wasn't guilty. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw movement. He turned to see Officer Turner standing at the edge of the hallway, looking at him through the bars. She didn't say anything, but there was something in her expression, something that told him she wasn't entirely convinced of his guilt. For the first time that night, Michael allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she would be the one to listen. The hours dragged on, a blur of harsh fluorescent lights, cold metal walls, and the relentless ticking of a clock that seemed to mock Michael's helplessness. Every moment he spent in that holding cell deepened the feeling that the world outside was moving without him, that the truth, his truth, was slipping further out of reach. He had been reduced to just another black man in cuffs, sitting alone in a police station, branded with a false narrative that had already taken root in the minds of those who should have known better. Michael sat on the hard bench, his back against the cold wall, trying to keep his thoughts from spiraling. His mind jumped between fear and frustration. How had everything gone so wrong? The memory of Jackson's smirk still lingered, his voice dripping with prejudice, confident that the system was on his side. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He knew that panicking wouldn't help. He had to stay calm, had to hold on to the hope that someone, perhaps Officer Turner or his colleagues at the hospital, would intervene. Surely, his family would have noticed his absence by now. His wife, Elise, would be worried sick, calling the hospital, calling his phone, trying to figure out why he hadn't come home. And his children. God, how would he explain this to his children? The thought of his family filled him with equal parts dread and resolve. He couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now. A soft click broke the silence, pulling Michael from his thoughts. He glanced toward the hallway, and there she was again, Officer Turner. She stood at the edge of the holding area, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him. There was something different about her demeanor this time, something almost hesitant. She wasn't the confident officer who had walked into the scene hours ago. Her shoulders were slumped, her brow furrowed as if she was grappling with an internal conflict. For a moment, Michael thought she might say something. He sat up straighter, locking eyes with her, silently pleading for her to speak, to acknowledge the injustice that was unfolding. But she remained silent, her gaze shifting from him to the corridor behind her. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts once more. A few more agonizing hours passed before the silence of the station was broken again. This time it wasn't the quiet presence of Turner, but the sharp ring of a phone from somewhere beyond the holding area. Michael could hear the muffled conversations of officers at their desks, the clatter of keyboards, and the occasional rustling of papers. It was a world just beyond his reach, yet it felt so far away. Then a commotion stirred. Voices were rising, footsteps quickening. Michael strained to hear what was going on, but the thick walls of the holding cell muffled most of the sound. He couldn't make out the details, but the tension was palpable. Something had changed. Moments later, the door to the holding area opened, and Officer Turner reappeared. This time her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She walked toward the cell with purpose, but her expression betrayed the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. "Dr. Wright," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you're being moved." "Moved?" Michael frowned, unsure of what she meant. Was this another step in the process of his wrongful detention, or was something else happening? "Where am I being moved to?" he asked, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. Turner unlocked the cell door, motioning for him to follow. Michael stood slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. He followed her down the narrow hallway, past rows of desks where officers were now glued to their computer screens, their faces tense. The air felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. When they reached the interview room, Turner opened the door and stepped aside to let Michael in. He hesitated for a moment, looking at her, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead, avoiding his eyes. Whatever internal conflict she was battling, she wasn't ready to confront it just yet. Inside the room sat a man Michael had never seen before, a middle-aged, balding man in a gray suit with sharp eyes that missed nothing. His demeanor was calm but authoritative, the kind of presence that commanded attention. Behind him, a woman in her 30s, dressed in a tailored blazer, stood with her arms crossed, her expression serious. Michael took a seat across from them, his heart pounding in his chest. The man cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together on the table. "Dr. Wright," he began, his voice measured, "my name is James Elliott. I'm a lawyer with the Civil Rights Defense Fund. This is Maria Hayes, one of our lead investigators." Michael blinked in surprise. The Civil Rights Defense Fund? How had they gotten involved so quickly? "We've been contacted by several people who are deeply concerned about your arrest," Elliott continued, his eyes fixed on Michael. "Your family, your colleagues, and some members of the community have raised the alarm. Apparently, word of what happened tonight has already started to spread." "Started to spread?" Michael echoed, still trying to wrap his mind around the sudden turn of events. Elliott nodded. "Yes. A video of your arrest has been circulating online. It's gone viral. People are talking, Dr. Wright, and not just your family and friends. The public is beginning to take notice." Michael felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, he was grateful that his story was getting out, that people were becoming aware of the injustice he was facing. But on the other hand, he knew how these situations could escalate. Once the public got involved, it could spiral into something much larger, much more difficult to control. "What happens now?" Michael asked, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. Elliott exchanged a glance with Maria before responding. "We're going to do everything we can to get you released. The fact that you were wrongfully detained is already causing an uproar, and we'll use that to your advantage. We've also gathered statements from the paramedics who were on the scene. They've confirmed that you were acting in a medical capacity and that you never posed any threat." Michael's breath hitched slightly at the news. The paramedics had spoken up on his behalf. That was something. That was progress. "But the situation is complicated," Maria interjected, her voice serious. "Officer Jackson, the one who arrested you, has a reputation. This isn't the first time he's been involved in a racially charged incident, but he's always managed to cover his tracks. The department has protected him before, and they may try to do it again." Michael clenched his fists under the table, anger surging through him. Of course. He had suspected as much. Jackson's smug attitude, his refusal to listen, his readiness to use force, it all pointed to a man who believed he was untouchable. "We're going to push back," Elliott said, his voice firm, "but you need to be prepared. This is going to get messy, especially now that the media has picked up the story. There are already protests being organized outside the station. People are demanding your release." Michael's mind reeled. Protests? It was all happening so fast. He had gone from being a doctor trying to save a life to the center of a public outcry within the span of a few hours. "But we'll get you out of here soon," Elliot added, sensing Michael's unease. "And when we do, we'll make sure that your story is heard. This won't go away quietly." Michael nodded, his emotions swirling between relief, anger, and uncertainty. He didn't want to be the face of a scandal. He hadn't asked for this. All he had done was stop to help a man in need. But now, it seemed, the situation had taken on a life of its own. Turner, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke up. I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Michael turned to look at her, surprised by the sudden apology. Her eyes were filled with guilt, and she looked as though she was struggling to find the right words. "I should have stepped in earlier," she admitted, her voice wavering. "I saw what was happening, but I didn't do anything to stop it. I should have done more." Michael regarded her for a moment, his expression softening slightly. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the regret for not standing up to Jackson. It wasn't enough to fix what had happened, but it was something. A small crack in the wall of silence and complicity that had allowed Jackson to act with impunity. "I appreciate that," Michael said quietly. "But it's not just about you. It's about the system that lets this happen." Turner nodded, her eyes downcast. She knew he was right. Elliot stood up, gathering his papers. "We'll have you out of here soon, Dr. Wright. In the meantime, stay calm and let us handle the legal side of things. This is far from over." As Michael was led back to his cell, he felt the weight of what was coming. The fight for justice had only just begun, and it was going to be a long, difficult road. But for the first time since his arrest, he wasn't alone. Outside the station, the crowd was already beginning to gather, their voices rising in protest against the injustice they had witnessed. And Michael knew that this fight was no longer just about him. It was about something much bigger. The day outside had long since turned to night, but Michael's cell remained as dim and cold as ever, with only the distant hum of fluorescent lights breaking the silence. The weight of the past hours pressed heavily on him, each minute bringing new questions. How long would he have to endure this? What would happen next? His mind reeled with images of his wife and children, worrying about where he was and the injustice that seemed to seep deeper into every corner of the world around him. But as the hours passed, so too did the sense of helplessness. He wasn't alone anymore. There were people outside fighting for him, people who knew the truth. And now, as his thoughts settled into a quieter rhythm, there was also the hope that this nightmare would soon come to an end. He was lost in these thoughts when the door to the holding area creaked open, and Officer Turner walked in again, this time more hesitant than before. Michael watched her approach, her face marked by something akin to guilt. She was holding a set of keys in her hand, her grip tight, as if she wasn't sure whether she should be using them. "Dr. Wright," she began, her voice quieter than before, "you're being released. The lawyers are still working on the formalities, but we've been instructed to let you go." For a moment, Michael didn't move, the words sinking in slowly. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to unravel, the weight of the situation easing just slightly. He wasn't free yet, not fully, but this was a step in the right direction. As Turner opened the cell door, the cold air from the hallway rushed in, and Michael stood slowly, stretching his sore limbs. "They're taking you to a safe place," Turner continued, avoiding his eyes. "Things outside, they've gotten bigger than anyone expected." Michael frowned as he stepped out of the cell, wondering what she meant. He followed her down the hallway, the silence between them thick and uneasy. The station seemed quieter now, but there was an underlying tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted since he had been locked away in that cell. Something significant. As they reached the main entrance of the station, Michael finally understood. Through the glass doors, he could see a crowd gathering on the streets, their voices rising in unison. There were signs, banners, and people standing shoulder to shoulder, chanting words he couldn't quite make out from inside. The flashing lights of cameras and the buzz of news reporters filled the space just outside the station's entrance, capturing every moment. The protest had grown larger than anyone had anticipated. Turner stopped short, glancing over at him. "This has become a lot more public than we thought it would. People are angry, Dr. Wright. They saw what happened to you, and they're not going to let it go." Michael took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this. When James Elliott, the lawyer, had told him that the video of his arrest had gone viral, Michael had thought it would be contained to social media. A few angry posts, maybe some outrage that would eventually die down. But this was something else entirely. The streets were packed with people, and their voices were loud and clear. Before Michael could process the enormity of what was happening, the door to the station opened, and James Elliott walked in, flanked by Maria Hayes, the lead investigator. Elliott's face was tense but determined as he strode toward Michael, his voice low and urgent. "Dr. Wright, we need to get you out of here quickly. Things are escalating, and we don't want you caught in the middle of what's going on outside. The crowd is demanding justice, but we need to move carefully. The department is still trying to protect Officer Jackson, but the pressure is mounting." Michael nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the scale of the situation. The crowd, the media, the legal fight, it was all happening so fast. He had gone from a doctor saving a life to the face of a growing movement in less than 24 hours. Elliott motioned for Michael to follow him, and together they headed toward the back exit of the station, away from the crowd. As they walked, Elliott spoke quickly, outlining the next steps. "We're going to take you to a secure location where you can be with your family," he explained. "There's already been a lot of media coverage, and it's only going to grow. You'll need to give a statement at some point, but for now, focus on staying safe. We're working on getting Officer Jackson suspended while we gather more evidence." Michael's chest tightened at the mention of Jackson. The memory of the officer's smug face as he had been handcuffed still lingered, the sting of that moment fresh in his mind. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated the way he had, for every black man and woman who had been wrongfully accused, who had been targeted because of the color of their skin. As they reached the back door, Elliott paused, turning to face him. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his tone somber. "We've uncovered some information about Officer Jackson that's going to be important as we move forward." Michael raised an eyebrow, his pulse quickening. "What kind of information?" Elliott glanced at Maria, who stepped forward, holding a folder in her hands. "It turns out that Jackson has a history," she began, her voice steady but serious. "This isn't the first time he's been involved in racially motivated incidents. He's had multiple complaints filed against him, but they were always swept under the rug by the department. He's been protected by his superiors for years." The revelation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He had suspected as much. Jackson's attitude, his aggression, the way he had treated Michael with instant suspicion, It all pointed to a man who believed he could act with impunity. But hearing the confirmation made the anger inside Michael flare to life again. How has he gotten away with it for so long? Michael asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Maria sighed, flipping open the folder to reveal a series of documents. He's been careful. Most of the incidents were minor enough that they didn't get much attention, and the victims were often people who didn't have the resources or support to fight back. But this time it's different. Your case has gone public, and the department can't hide behind their usual excuses. Elliot nodded, his expression grim. We're going to use this to our advantage, Dr. Wright. We're going to make sure that Jackson and everyone who protected him is held accountable. But it's going to be a fight. Michael clenched his fists, the fire inside him growing. I'm ready for that fight, he said, his voice steady. No one else should have to go through what I did. Elliot gave him a small nod of approval. Good, because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about something much bigger. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the sounds of the protest still echoing from the front of the station. A black SUV was waiting for them, the engine running, ready to take Michael to safety. As he climbed into the back seat, he caught one last glimpse of the crowd through the alleyway. The signs, the chanting, the overwhelming show of support. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the SUV pulled away from the station, leaving the chaos behind, Michael felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. He was free for now, but the fight was just beginning. The truth about Jackson and the department was starting to unravel, and Michael knew that he couldn't stop until justice was served. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced for too long. The ride to the safe house was quiet, the streets outside dark and deserted. Michael leaned back in his seat, his mind racing with everything he had learned. Jackson's history, the protests, the media attention, it was all spiraling so quickly. But even as the chaos swirled around him, Michael felt a sense of clarity settling over him. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight. Not just for himself, but for his family, for his community, for everyone who had been wrongfully targeted because of the color of their skin. And as the SUV turned the corner, taking him away from the station and toward the next chapter of the battle ahead, Michael made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this go. He would see it through to the end, no matter how long it took. The days following Michael's release passed in a blur of media frenzy, legal briefings, and the overwhelming support of a community that had rallied behind him. As he sat in the living room of the safe house, the tension that had once filled his chest had been replaced by a steady resolve. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the night of his arrest, Michael felt a sense of control returning to his life. His wife, Elise, and their children had joined him at the safe house the day after his release. Seeing their faces, the worry etched deeply into Elise's brow and the confusion in his children's eyes, had been both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about clearing his name. This was about ensuring that his family never had to go through something like this again. News reports played on the television constantly, with the faces of pundits and experts flashing across the screen, debating what had happened to Michael and how the system had failed. The protests outside the police station had grown larger, with civil rights groups, community leaders, and even celebrities speaking out in support of Michael. The story had become national news, the video of his arrest spreading across social media like wildfire. In every corner of the country, people were talking about what had happened to Dr. Michael Wright. But behind the scenes, a more insidious fight was unfolding. Officer Jackson, the man who had wrongfully arrested him, remained on duty. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct, the police department had not suspended him, at least not yet. Jackson's superiors had tried to shield him, to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding, but the pressure was mounting. Michael sat at the kitchen table, flipping through legal documents as James Elliott, his lawyer, and Maria Hayes, the investigator, sat across from him. Their expressions were grim, though Michael had learned that this was their default mode in times of stress. "We've gathered enough evidence to make a solid case against Jackson," Maria said, laying out a folder filled with witness statements, internal police records, and footage from the night of Michael's arrest. "The paramedics' testimony is especially strong. They confirmed that you were acting in your capacity as a doctor and that there was no reason for Jackson to have treated you the way he did." Elliott nodded, but his expression remained cautious. "The problem," he began, "is that the department is still dragging its feet. They know the public is watching, but they're hoping that this will blow over if they wait long enough. They've been trying to downplay Jackson's previous incidents for years, and they're not going to give him up easily." Michael clenched his fists, anger bubbling up again at the thought of Jackson continuing to wear a badge. How can they let him stay on duty after everything he's done? How many more people does he need to hurt before they do something? "It's about protecting their own," Elliott said, his tone weary but resolute. "Jackson isn't just an individual officer. He's a symptom of a much larger problem. The department's culture of silence and cover-ups runs deep. If they admit that Jackson was wrong, it opens the door to investigating every other questionable case he's been involved in. They don't want that. They want this to go away." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "They can't just sweep this under the rug. People are paying attention now. This is too big to ignore." Maria leaned forward, her voice firm. "You're right. This has gained too much attention. The protests are growing and the media isn't letting go, but we need to push harder. We need to force their hand." Elliott opened another folder, this one containing a draft of a public statement. "We've been working on this," he said. "It's a formal demand for Jackson's suspension and a full investigation into his conduct. We're going to release it to the press, along with all the evidence we've gathered. Once it's out there, the department won't be able to ignore it." Michael scanned the statement, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the next step in the fight. The truth was about to come out in full force, and the department would have no choice but to act. "When do we release it?" Michael asked, his voice steady. "Tomorrow morning," Elliott replied. "We're holding a press conference outside the courthouse. The media will be there, along with your supporters. We'll make sure the whole country knows what's going on." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, everyone who had been silenced by a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. He would be their voice. The following morning, Michael stood in front of the courthouse steps, surrounded by a sea of supporters. Signs and banners filled the air, with messages calling for justice, accountability, and the suspension of Officer Jackson. The press was out in full force, cameras flashing and microphones pointed in Michael's direction. James Elliott stood beside him, his expression calm but determined. As the crowd quieted, Elliott stepped forward to the podium, holding the statement in his hand. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We are here today to demand justice for Dr. Michael Wright and to call for the immediate suspension of Officer Jackson whose actions on the night of Dr. Wright's wrongful arrest were not only inappropriate but unlawful. We have gathered substantial evidence, including eyewitness testimony, video footage, and records of Officer Jackson's previous misconduct, which the department has consistently ignored. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in support. Elliott continued, his tone sharp and unyielding. The time for silence is over. The department can no longer protect Officer Jackson at the expense of the truth. We are calling for a full investigation into his conduct, as well as a review of the department's handling of similar cases. Dr. Wright's arrest was not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern of abuse that has been allowed to fester unchecked. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. As of today, we are filing a formal complaint with the city, demanding that Officer Jackson be removed from duty immediately, pending a full investigation. We will not rest until justice is served. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices blending into a powerful chant of "Justice for Dr. Wright, justice for all." Michael stepped forward, his heart pounding as he faced the crowd. The cameras flashed, capturing every moment. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I want to thank all of you for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never expected to be standing here, in front of all of you, fighting for my own freedom and for the justice that so many people deserve. What happened to me was wrong, but it's not just about me. It's about every black man and woman who has been treated like they don't belong, like their lives don't matter. We cannot allow this to continue." The crowd cheered, their voices filling the air with hope and determination. "This fight isn't over," Michael continued, "but I promise you, I will not stop until Officer Jackson is held accountable. I will not stop until the system that protects people like him is exposed for what it is. And I will not stop until we have justice, not just for me, but for all of us." As Michael stepped back from the podium, the crowd's cheers echoed in his ears, a powerful reminder that he was no longer fighting alone. This was bigger than him, bigger than any one person. The movement for justice had taken on a life of its own, and there was no stopping it now. The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. Within hours, the police department released a statement announcing that Officer Jackson had been suspended pending an internal investigation. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into Jackson's conduct revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior. Years of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct that had been covered up by his superiors. The department was forced to confront its own corruption, and several high-ranking officers were placed on administrative leave as the investigation expanded. For Michael, the journey was far from over. The legal battle continued, and the scars from his wrongful arrest would take time to heal. But as the days passed, he began to see the impact of his fight. The protests grew larger, and more people began to speak out, demanding accountability and change. One evening, weeks after the press conference, Michael sat with his family in the living room of their home. The chaos of the past months had settled into something more manageable, and for the first time in a long while, they could simply be together without the weight of the world pressing down on them. Elise sat beside him, her hand resting on his, their children playing nearby. The television was on in the background, the news anchor reporting on the latest developments in the investigation. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "Officer Jackson, the police officer involved in the wrongful arrest of Dr. Michael Wright, has officially been charged with misconduct and abuse of power. The city has also announced a comprehensive review of the police department's handling of similar cases, with reforms expected to be implemented in the coming months. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Justice was being served, slowly but surely. As he looked around at his family, their faces filled with love and hope, Michael knew that the fight had been worth it. They were safe, and the world was beginning to change, one step at a time, and in the end, that was all he could ask for. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you liked it and want to know more about similar situations, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Give it a like and share this video with your friends to discuss what you would do in a similar situation. And don't go away. There are many more interesting videos on our channel that may interest you. Just click on one of the videos on the screen and keep watching.